So last week, for a few days, my kids, my wife, and I went up to the Bighorn Mountains to just kind of get away a little bit with my family. We camped up there for 3 nights or so towards the end of last week. And we're coming home last Saturday, and we're pulling a camper that is my in-laws' camper, and we're using their pickup, and we're coming home, and you get out of the Bighorns and you drop down into Buffalo, and then you start heading towards Casper, and there's like nothing out there. Like, you all say Nebraska is bad. Have you not driven on that road? There's just nothing there. So we're driving on this road, and it's like 100 degrees outside, and but we're thankful we're inside the pickup and away from it all. But we get not too far out of Buffalo, and the temperature gauge on the pickup starts going up. And then it starts saying that we're low on coolant. And so I'm having to slow way down so that it doesn't overheat, and we have to pull over so that it cools down a little bit, and then we can go a little bit, but we're driving 10 or 15 miles an hour slower than how you're driving when you're pulling a camper anyway, which is slower than normal. And so we're just not going as fast, and I'm getting a little frustrated. I'm just like, oh my gosh, come on, can we just get to Casper so we can give this stupid pickup to my father-in-law, and it can be his problem, and I can get it. It's how I think sometimes, don't judge me. And then I can get in my Suburban, we can just go home. And so we're going along, and we get to Casey, the little town of Casey, and we pull in, and we go to buy some more coolant and get to the register, and apparently my credit card company decided that I shouldn't be buying coolant in the little town of Casey, and so I had to deal with that there, and so it's just kind of racking up here a little bit, and we head down the road a little bit further, and the gauge on the thermometer saying it's now 105 or 107 outside, and then all of a sudden there's this loud boom, and I look in the rearview mirror and the side mirror of the pickup, and there's tire tread going everywhere. And I thought, thank you. So I pull it over, and one of the tires on the trailer had blown out. And in that moment, as I'm sitting on the side of the road, looking in my father-in-law's tools for the right wrench socket size to pull this trailer tire off, and I couldn't find it. And in a moment there, I thought, I'm just done. Like, I've had enough. It's 100 degrees outside. We're just going to, the right thing for me to do is just to have my family and my kids sit inside of a pickup on the side of the road that we can't turn on, and we're just going to wait for like 4 more hours until my father-in-law can get here, and then it can be his problem from here on out. I'm just done. Like I'm not going to deal with this anymore. This is ridiculous. Well, in that moment, the problem was just bigger than I thought I could handle, and of course it's not, right? I mean, we've all been there from time to time. The tire, in fact, didn't take more than 20 minutes to change, and then we're back going down the road. And it didn't, driving 50 miles an hour rather than 60 miles an hour on the road pulling a camper really didn't make us that much longer than it would have before. But sometimes I think we get ourselves in these places where whatever is before us just seems so big that we just can't handle it. That whatever is kind of looking at us in the eye, it just seems like we just can't handle it anymore. We're just going to give up. We're going to sit back and just let it all play out the way that it's going to play out. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 17 today. As we're looking at the life of David, we're going to talk about one that all of us, if you went to Sunday school like a good kid, you learned about in Sunday school, right? And this is the story of David and Goliath. And so it goes something like this. We're going to jump around a little bit throughout this chapter. But in Israel, there's this part of Israel geographically where there's many hills and valleys. Like just kind of this whole area is just made up of hills and valleys. And within these hills and valleys are many of the ancient cities that we read about throughout the Old Testament. They're just kind of scattered throughout this kind of hilly area. And so what would happen is that the enemies of Israel would try and work their way into this land, and so they would come into the valleys, but they would quickly want to get up onto the hills. Why? Well, because you don't want to have the low ground in a battle. You want to have the high ground. And so they would get up on top of a hill, and then sure enough, Israel would be alarmed that they're coming. And so they would call up their army, and they would go out and they would meet them. And you have these two different armies on different hills kind of standing and staring at each other. This was a fairly common thing that happened throughout this time. And so in 1 Samuel 17, we have the great enemy of Israel, the Philistines, that have done this. They have made their way into Israel's land. They're on one hill on this side, we'll say. And then Israel's army gets called up, and they are on the other hill that's over here. And in between these two hills is the valley of Elah. And in Elah here, because this is important if you don't know this story, there's a little stream that runs through there that has some nice smooth rocks. I'm just going to throw that in there just for a fun fact. Right. So you have these two armies that are here on both sides with this valley in between, and nothing's really happening, right? You don't take your army and say, hey, let's just run down this hill and run up the other side. We should be good, right? Like, no, that's idiocy. That's poor stewardship. That's poor planning. Essentially, you have a stalemate between these two armies. And so then what would happen when you were just staring at each other for a while, maybe throwing rocks at each other or yelling across at each other, one side would say, okay, enough is enough. We're going to send out one man into the valley, and he's going to call out somebody else from the other side, and they're going to kind of just duke it out there, and whoever wins this kind of one-on-one battle, then that man's army wins the overall battle that we're kind of facing here. And so you can kind of picture it. You have the Philistines on one side. You have the Israelites on the other. They're sitting here just kind of staring at each other. They're in this stalemate. There's a stream that's going through in the valley of Elah, and there's nothing happening here. They're yelling at each other maybe. Maybe they're trying to insult each other or trying to get the others to come over to their side or whatever it may be. But finally the Philistines say, well, enough is enough. And so they call out their warrior, their champion, their great soldier named Goliath. They call him out and send him down into the valley. Let's read about what Goliath was like. Let's pick up in verse 4. It says this about Goliath. Then a champion named Goliath from Gath came out from the Philistine camp. He was 9 feet 9 inches tall and wore a bronze helmet and a bronze scale armor that weighed 125 pounds. There was bronze armor on his shins and a bronze sword that slung between his shoulders. His spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, and the iron point of his spear weighed 15 pounds. In addition, a shield bearer was walking in front of him. This guy was huge. Like, I'm a big guy. I'm not oblivious to this. And if you've seen my father or met my father, he is much bigger than I am, okay? We are just big people. We come from a big line of guys in our family. We would be nothing compared to this guy. This guy was huge, and he comes out into the valley, and he starts yelling at Israel to send out their best man and confront him. Any takers on that one? You want to go up against a 9 foot 9 inch guy? I don't think I would. And he's calling out there, come send your greatest warrior to fight me. Winner take all here. And then as you read on in this chapter, it says that King Saul of Israel and the Israelite army, they heard this and they were dismayed and they were terrified. Seeing the greatness of the problem before them, seeing the greatness of the issue standing before them, it put them in fear. Let's just pause here for a minute. Let's just make an observation, if we can, about ourselves. I think it's easy for us to look at what is in front of us as a bigger issue than it really is, right? Like last Saturday when I was sitting on the side of the road trying to figure out where the whatever size wrench that I needed to take that tire off, the problem was bigger than I thought I could handle at that moment. And I think we do this. We deal with things and we go through things, and I'm not negating any of that we're going through, but sometimes we make things bigger in our minds than what they actually are. It can be big things, serious things that we're dealing with. Things like a sickness that was diagnosed and you don't know what the end result is going to be. It can put fear in our lives. Maybe a family member or a friend is hurt or is dealing with something and they aren't believed to pull through it. This can strike fear into our hearts and into our lives. Maybe parents or siblings or kids or somebody you know has started using the word divorce. And it can strike fear into our hearts, into our lives, because we don't know how things are going to play out. Or maybe for us, maybe it's just a sin that we have in our life. Maybe it's just this one sin that keeps presenting itself, we keep struggling with, we keep falling to, we can't overcome it, and it just continually puts fear into our life. Whatever it may be, maybe it's depression, maybe it's rejection, maybe it's expectations that others have put on our lives. Whatever it may be, we have these things in our lives, and we blow them up and we make them bigger than what they are. And so what do we do in those times? Well, so often, especially initially, we don't attack. We don't run after the problem head on. Most of us hold back. Most of us get scared for a moment. Most of us, for at least a time, we live in fear. Most of the time, we just hold back a little bit. And this is where we find the Israelite army. We find the Israelite army with the problem clearly before them. And they're standing back in fear. We have the king of Israel standing back in fear here. Their opponents are not advancing. They themselves are not advancing at all. And the only option here really is to send somebody down to fight this guy, and everybody is scared. Nobody is stepping out and taking that step. And in walks David. In walks David. He's a young man, a few years older than where we picked up on him last week, but he's too young to fight in the army. And so he's still staying at home with Dad. Dad is too old. Jesse's too old to fight in the army, but 3 of Jesse's sons, David's older brothers, are in Saul's army at this point. And so Dad Jesse decides to send David out with some food for the day and sends David out to deliver this to his brothers. And so David comes up to the area where they are fighting, and all of this is going on. And we find Goliath still down there taunting and calling out and trying to get somebody to come out and fight him. And David walks in and he sees this. And David starts asking questions. Questions like, why are none of you going out there to fight him? It's what you want to hear from your younger brother, right? Who just a little while ago was anointed as the future king of Israel. I'm sure they forgot about that. So he starts asking, why are none of you going out and fighting? Why are none of you going out to defeat this guy? And I have to imagine maybe in David's mind it's even pointing more towards Saul too, like Saul, king of Israel, why are you not going out to fight this guy as well? Starts asking all these questions, and all of this then starts getting back then to King Saul. And so King Saul calls David in and starts having a conversation with David here as well. And David finally stands up as a boy, teenager, in front of the king of Israel and the leader of this army and says, I, David, I will go down and I will fight this man. I will go down and fight him. Saul immediately rejects this idea, as I think anybody would. Immediately rejects this idea. You're too young, you're only a boy, you don't have any experience. This guy is a seasoned veteran. He's obviously still alive. He's pretty good at what he does. This guy's been fighting for all of his life. But David doesn't accept that answer. Let's look now at verse 34 of 1 Samuel chapter 17. This is what happens. David answers Saul, your servant has been tending his father's sheep. Whenever a lion or a bear came and carried off a lamb from the flock, I went after it, struck it down, and rescued the lamb from its mouth. If it reared up against me, I would grab it by its fur, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed lions and bears. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. Then David said, the Lord who rescues me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. And then Saul said to David, go and may the Lord be with you. Go and may the Lord be with you. There's really nothing else to say at that moment. Go, and may the Lord be with you. And so they begin getting David ready to kind of go down there and fight. And Saul does the thing that probably most of us would. Hey, take my armor, take my weapons. You know, it's the best that we have to offer. Take and use them while you go down and do what I should be doing. And so they start putting on the armor on little David here, and putting on the shields and giving him the sword and everything. And he's putting on this, this coat of armor and this bronze helmet and putting the sword around the waist. And it just wasn't working out. It was too heavy. It was too big. It was too awkward. He wasn't used to it, and it just wasn't working out. And so he takes it off. He insists that he goes down without it. Now, what you have now is a young boy, a teenager, going down to fight a giant who also doesn't have any protection, who doesn't have any armor, who doesn't really have any real weapon or sword here to take with him. And so David walks himself down to the valley, goes up to the stream, picks out 5 smooth stones, puts them in his little bag there. He grabs his staff, he grabs his slingshot, and he starts heading down towards Goliath. And here's how it goes. Let's read this chunk starting in verse 41. It says, "Then the Philistine came closer and closer to David, and with the shield bearer in front of him, when the Philistine looked and saw David, he despised him because he was just a youth, healthy and handsome. He said to David, am I a dog that you come against me with sticks?" Then he cursed David by his gods. "Come here," the Philistine called to David, "and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with a dagger, spear, and sword, but I come against you in the name of Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel's armies. You have defied him. Today the Lord will hand you over to me. Today I'll strike you down, cut your head off, and give the corpses of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the creatures of the earth. And then all the world will know that the Israel has a God, and this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will hand you over to us." And he will hand you over to us. I think it's easy for us to kind of sympathize a little bit with David when we read through this. I think it's easy for us to look at David and say, man, he's just a boy. He's just a boy, and granted, he was no wuss. I mean, it's clear that he could hold his own. He fought off lions and bears, protecting his father's sheep. And you can imagine it, at some point, there was probably, people that would come in to try and take the sheep as well. And so he's fighting off actual human beings there as well. He's a strong kid. Like he's the kid that we would say now threw bales at his grandfather's ranch during the summer times, right? I mean, he was capable. He was very capable of holding his own. And we can look at the story, and it's a kid fighting a giant, and we can think that there's no chance for David going into this. And logically speaking, there really isn't, right? This is a no-brainer. Logically, if you just look one compared to the other. And I put myself in David's place here a little bit, and I think, man, if that was me, I would be scared to death. Like I would be with everybody else up on the other side of the hill where it's safe, kind of cowering back in the corner a little bit. I would be fearful in that moment. But we see David going up against the best of the Philistines here. He should, in our minds, he should be scared, but we don't see fear here. We see courage. We see strength. We see him stepping out and doing this. Why? Well, I think the key verse here in this whole passage, in this whole story, is verse 46 and 47. It says this again: "Today the Lord will hand you over to me. Today I'll strike you down, cut your head off, and give the corpses of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the creatures of the earth. Then all the world will know that Israel has a God, and this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will hand you over to us." The battle is the Lord's, and he will hand you over to us. And he said this to Saul earlier on in verse 37. David said to Saul, "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine as well." The battle is the Lord's. And this really is a truth for us. This is a truth that we need to be faced with, and we need to get our minds wrapped around. We have things that come up in our lives that we're faced with, that we are challenged with in whatever way, and whatever is before us, whatever that struggle is for you, and it could be dozens and dozens of things, but whatever that struggle is for you that is coming up, that may have you sitting in fear, that may have us sitting in fear of what the future looks like. So oftentimes, it doesn't have the advantage in our lives that we think it does. So oftentimes, we give too much power and influence to these things coming up in our lives than what we should. We make these things more powerful in our minds than we should. We make them stronger in our minds than we should. We make them bigger in our minds than we should. We exaggerate these things bigger than we should. And even a further truth is this: if you're a follower of God, you have a power on your side that those challenges that face you don't have. You have a power on your side that others don't. Because at a later time in David's life, this was said about him in 1 Chronicles chapter 18, verse 6. It says that he placed garrisons in Aram of Damascus, and they became David's subjects and brought tribute. And this is the key: the Lord made David victorious wherever he went. Don't miss that. The Lord made David victorious wherever he went. When David was in the midst of victory after victory, and God gave him these victories, it was not because of David's ability as a leader. It was not because of his superior army. It was not because of his military knowledge. It wasn't because of any of those things that David had to offer. Really what it was God gave victory after victory to David because David was focused on God. And he was chasing after God, and he wasn't afraid to go up against whatever was brought before him. And at the end of the day, David knew as a young boy with a sling, walking up to a 9'9" giant, and then as an older man leading kingdoms and leading armies, David knew that with God on his side, there was no enemy that could stand a chance. There was nothing that could stand a chance, and we forget that. We read and listen to stories about boys defeating giants. We can read about armies defeating other armies and think that our situation is just so much greater than that. It's so much different than that. And we look at ourselves and what's going on in our lives, and I'm not in any way negating anything that is going on, because some of us are dealing with very real things in our lives, very real diseases and illnesses and death, and none of that is easy. Some of us are dealing maybe with depression or expectations from other, and that is not easy. Some of us are dealing with loss or change, and that is not easy, because I understand. If you remember back at the end of last year, Kimmy and I lost 3 grandparents in the matter of just a couple months. And 2 of those grandparents passed away within 8 days of each other. We understand loss, and we understand the hurt that can present. And it's difficult, and I know this. But the other truth I know is this: my God is greater than death. And my God is greater than sickness. And my God is greater than disease. My God is greater than divorce or change or depression or others' expectations or whatever is going on and whatever is facing you. Our God is bigger than it. And we need to remember that. And so when we look at the story of David and Goliath, it's easy to land at this place where we can say God gives us the courage. God gives us the courage to face the battles that are before us. And I think we've all heard that message before. God gives us the courage to step out and go fight the battles that are before us. And it's easy to land at that, and we say that with God, when we're focused on and following God, there is no battle too big, there's no giant too strong, there is no struggle too great for us to go fight when God is on our side. And we can walk into battles with strength and courage and hope because God of the universe, the God that created everything, is on our side. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I believe that for sure. that God goes into battles and he fights with us and he gives us the courage to fight the battles that are in our lives. But I also think when we take that angle, we're missing something in this story. I think when we take that angle of God gives us the courage to go fight the battles in our lives, I think we're missing something very, very big in this story. Because I think when we're looking at David and Goliath, I think so many times we want to be David, but we're not David. I think when we look at this story of David and Goliath, we aren't David. We want to be David. It makes me feel good to be David. It makes me proud and feel empowered to be David. It makes me feel good to know that I can go out and I can fight head on anything that's coming after me. I want to be David, right? We want to be David in this story because he's the hero, right? We want to be David, but I got to be honest, I don't think we're David in this story. I don't think we're David in this story. I think we're the ones that are still up on the hill, cowering back in fear because we don't have the strength or the courage to go out and to fight. And I think in the story of David and Goliath, we're not David, Jesus is David. I think in this story, we are the ones that are holding back in fear. We're the ones that are sitting in the corner knowing that we can't face the giant on our own. And who steps onto the scene? Who steps onto the scene? We have David, who one chapter before is anointed as the future king of Israel, and he comes in and he faces the enemy, he cuts off his head, and then the rest of the enemy runs. He flees away. What does this sound like? To me, it sounds like a man named Jesus who walked onto a scene. He was baptized, he received the Holy Spirit, he went out and defeated Satan by how? By going to a cross and shedding his blood. Revelation chapter 12 talks about how evil is overcome by the blood of the Lamb. And when that happens, evil is defeated and the rest of evil flees away. I think in the story of David and Goliath, as much as we want to be David, Jesus is David. And we are cowering back. We are unable to face our giants, and God's anointed one comes in and quickly and easily slays the giants that are before us. And the reason we can face our giants is because we have Jesus fighting on our behalf. And we have faith that he will be victorious. And for those who place their faith and hope and trust in Christ, there is no giant too large. There is no struggle too great. There is nothing that Christ cannot defeat on our behalf. And we must have faith to know that he can do it. And we must have faith to know that no matter what the outcome, Christ is fighting on our behalf, and we can trust in the outcome, whatever it may be. And so, for many of us, I think we need to change our perspective a little bit here. We give giants in our lives, we give the big things that are facing us in our lives too much power. We give it too much influence. We give it too much dominance in our lives. And we need to know and we need to have faith that Jesus fights for us. Jesus fights for us, and we can walk with courage and strength because whatever battle or whatever struggle, whatever issue you are dealing with that you're facing, the battle is Christ's, and he fights for us. And we can walk into it knowing that truth. And we can have faith that no matter what the outcome, Christ is fighting for us, and that outcome is in God's hands. Let's pray. God, I'm thankful as we continue to look at the life of David, and as we look at this very familiar passage and story. And Father, I know I'm tempted, and I want this to be about me. And I want this story to be about what I can do when I can go out and face giants, and I can come victorious. But this story is about you, and this story is about Jesus and what he has done and what he does do for us. And so, Father, as we are facing whatever is going on in our lives, whatever is coming up, that, Father, we would just keep our eyes set on you, put our faith and our hope and our trust in you, knowing that you fight for us, and we can be confident in whatever the outcome may be. Father, give us the strength and the courage to believe that and to hold on to that truth in our lives. We thank you. We love you. It's in your Son Jesus' name I pray all this. Amen.